All right. Hello, everyone. I'm hoping you can hear me. I'm wondering if Sasha will send me a sign so I know everybody can hear me. Oh, you're muted, Sasha.
Of course, I'm muted. Okay, maybe we'll wait just a minute because attendees are just flowing in, and it looks like it's kind of a gradual pickup as
Sure.
people are being let in. And there might have been a few that had to download the platform, as it's probably pretty new to a lot of people. So let's pick a magic number for attendees when we get there. Seeing as how we're about at 98 registrants, do you guys want to say about 45 when we get there, or 50? Then we're at 31 so far. I don't know if you guys are seeing that on your screen.
Sure.
And thank you for everybody that's listening. And we'll just give it maybe a minute, and then we'll start with these wonderful ladies here. And I'm going to turn off my webcam while we're waiting. Oh, but the dead air is kind of a weird thing to have as well. But we're at 33.
I was going to say, I can hear you, Sasha. I just can't see you.
Yep, it's the voice in the dark.
So organizer.
And Riley, I think you're okay to go ahead. So because people will be coming in, and yeah, they'll catch all the really great stuff as we go forward.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so my name's Riley Hewitt. I work for the Southern Alberta Land Trust Society, otherwise known as SALT. I'm so pleased to have everybody here today. I was blown away by the response that we had online to the webinar, which is just great. I think Sasha said 98 people signed up, so that's terrific. And obviously there's a lot of interest in badgers, which is why we decided to organize this. I just thought I would lead in with a little introduction to what SALTS is as an organization, and the PCF, which is the Prairie Conservation Forum, which is hosting this webinar for us. So PCF was established by the Government of Alberta in 1989 to implement Alberta's commitment to the Prairie Conservation Action Plan, which we refer to as a PCAP. These plans map out specific measures for conserving and protecting native prairie and parkland habitats and species. The PCF is largely supported through donations and is directed by membership and a board of both government and non-government organizations in Alberta. SALTS is a member of the board, of which I get to be a part of. And so for more information on PCF, you can, or to look at the current action plan, you can find them online. They have a website, or you can find them on social media pages. So SALTS is a nonprofit society started by a group of ranchers in 1998. SALT's key focus is to partner with landowners to protect private lands of high ecological value from being fragmented and degraded. We do this through conservation easements. We also get to do some fun work on other conservation projects and outreach, like this session on badgers. And so for more information on us, you can find us on social media pages, or we also have a website. So to the good stuff. Without further ado, let me introduce tonight's speaker, Nikki Heim. She's here with us today as an independent consultant and wildlife ecologist. Nikki has worked as a wildlife researcher in human-wildlife coexistence specialist and provincial ecologist in BC and Alberta for over 15 years and is currently residing in Canmore, Alberta. During this time, she is focused on understanding population dynamics of medium to large size carnivores and working towards finding ways we can live together. Nikki has worked with badgers previously, and SALTS was so pleased she agreed to partner with us so we can learn more about how we can better coexist with badgers as landowners and what exactly it means to have badgers in our landscape. So with that, let me join everybody in welcoming Nikki, and I will pass the presentation over to her.
Thank you, Riley and Sasha. Welcome, everyone. I can't see anyone, but I'll just speak to you as I can. Hopefully everyone's having a good evening. Appreciate the introduction. So We're here tonight to talk about badgers, and what I wanted to share with you was what I had the opportunity to start learning about when I worked on a badger project in central BC back in 2008, and it was just really understanding the important role these little guys play in our grassland systems. There's sort of an animal that often goes unnoticed or unconsidered. They're small, you don't see them very often. They're often underground, and we'll get into more of that kind of stuff later. But that's what we're here today. We're focusing a little bit more on the Alberta populations, but a lot of the behavior for the species in Alberta and across the country are really similar. Okay, so I'm just gonna move that out of the way. Okay, so I just thought I'd run through what we're going to be going through tonight. Sorry, one sec here. There. Okay, there we go. So just the topics for tonight is I'll talk to you about a species as a member of the weasel family. And then we'll go into a little bit about their historic and current distribution and species status. And then into the really good stuff, the role that they play in maintaining healthy grassland ecosystems. This is kind of some of my favorite stuff, is I've got some ecological fun facts that I wanted to share with you tonight. Go through the leading threats to the species, some ways that we can learn more about them. Play a little game of true or false, just to have a few questions, switch it up a bit. And then kind of talk about some ways and discuss how we can try and live together with these little critters. So the North American badger, this is what they look like if you haven't seen them yourself. They're often confused with reputations from the European badger, the African badger. They're pretty similar. They're also a fierce animal. Most of the weasels are. And they are, in fact, a member of the weasel family, so the Mustelidae family. So badgers fit kind of in size between a fisher and a wolverine. But they're all related to several weasels, from the least weasel, marten, fisher, up to wolverine. So a fisher is similar in size, can be a little bit smaller than a badger, and they primarily lived in forested habitats. They really depend on old growth trees. And then you get over to a wolverine, which can span boreal into mountain habitats. They rely more on snow. You don't find them as often in grassland systems, more up in the high boreal. And they will range up to about 40 pounds, where a badger will get up to about 20. So they're quite a bit bigger than a badger, just to kind of give you a context for where these species fit within their family groups. So badgers are considered a fossorial mesocarnivore. It's kind of a loaded term. So fossorials, basically, they spend most of their lives underground and digging. Meso is that medium-sized carnivore. So they're highly adapted for digging. They have really round, robust claws, kind of a stout face and neck. They have really loose skin that also allows them to kind of get into cracks and roots and under rocks. And they do spend a lot of time and much of their lives underground, and are considered the only true burrowing predator in Canada. So just to touch a little bit on their distribution and status, so where you find them, and this is a distribution map for badgers for North America. And you can see here there's 4 subspecies across North America. There's 3 subspecies that occur in Canada, and 2 of which, the Jacksoni and Jeffersoni, which are on the furthest east and furthest west, and that dark orange and light blue. Those 2 species are considered endangered by federal listing. And the subspecies that occurs across the prairie provinces, including in Alberta, is the Taxodiea taxus. And they're federally listed as a species of special concern. In Alberta, this subspecies is ranked as sensitive, and it was ranked back in 2002, so a little outdated. And part of that is because they're very data deficient. So the prairie province subspecies, we don't really have a lot of population information on this species. At present, there's no population estimate for the species. So data deficient basically means that there isn't enough information on their numbers and trends of how they're doing, if their numbers are going up and down over time, to be able to properly list them and assess their status. So this is just kind of zooming into a range map for Alberta. It's a little bit harder to see, it's kind of white. You've got some historic range, which is sort of in the bottom there. It's lightly colored, and there is some thought of recent range expansion, probably with warming temperatures. Badgers are considered a fur bearer, so there are trapping seasons for badgers in Alberta, and on private property, there is an open year-round hunt is permitted. They are believed to be extirpated in several regions, but again, there's not a lot of good information on them. And when I say extirpated, if folks aren't familiar with that word, that just essentially means that they're no longer in that area. They're not extinct, but they've just, the habitat can't support them in that local area, or they've been out trapped or hunted in that area. So badgers in Alberta, particularly here, you find them mostly in parkland, prairie, and cold desert ecosystems. And what really drives them is an availability of their kind of preferred prey species, which is small mammals, ground squirrels in particular, and then the availability of friable kind of loose soils that are nice to dig, where they can dig up their burrows. They're pretty tolerant to people for the most part. They can be quite shy, but to human development like roads, traffic, railways, you will often see burrows right next to roadways and stuff. So they can adapt to our infrastructure and some activities, as long as we're kind of not poking our noses into their burrows. So their role in maintaining healthy grassland systems, that's really kind of what we're here to talk about tonight. Well, that's a big part of this discussion. Just wanted to share some kind of highlights for you. So one of the big ones that not everybody knows about with badgers is they typically know, if you do know about this species, that their preferred prey is small mammals, as I mentioned, ground squirrels, prairie dogs, yellow belly marmots. But they also are pretty adaptable and fairly resilient species, so they can predate and supplement their diet with a whole host of other species. So they'll dig up and get at muskrats, they'll eat snakes, amphibians, they'll get into birds, particularly swallows' nests, and eat their eggs. So they do play a pretty key role as a predator in these grassland systems. And they're also considered to be top-down regulators of these small prey, basically meaning they can really make a dent through the numbers that they hunt into their populations and into their numbers. So regulating kind of that predator down to prey dynamic. It is estimated that they can consume 2 to 3 ground squirrels per day, and some studies have suggested that that reduces a population by about 50% while they're in the area. They do predate on small mammals all year round, including in the winter, which I'll talk to you about a little bit later. And typically they can make a real dent in the juvenile population in the spring for small mammals. So one of the most important roles the badgers play is modifying their own environment to their benefit. So this kind of engineering and digging behavior can really have a disproportionate effect on the other species that live near them and the systems that they live in. So they're kind of part of this idea of a burrow web. And you can see I've kind of got a little arrow pointing to the badger in this image. And I like this image. It kind of just does a nice job at depicting all the other species that it would interact with. So when they dig a burrow, they impact other species by providing habitat for them and digging up soils to turn over the topsoil, which increases some vegetation growth, water infiltration. I'll go through those, but you can just kind of see that they really do play a role with all these other species here. So some of those, as I was mentioning, if we list them off, these badgers can really improve soil aeration by their digging behavior, water infiltration, nutrient cycling, really increase the vascular plant diversity. So having more complex structure of plants by having that natural disturbance, which is essentially their digging behavior. They increase soil and vertebrate diversity, increase terrestrial vertebrate diversity, often through creating these habitats for other species. And then supporting ecological resilience and resistance, which basically comes at having a diverse ecosystem. The more species and plants and diversity you have, the more resilient an ecosystem can be. And so what I mentioned is they have this disproportionate effect and a really positive effect for other species. And they can also be considered a keystone species. They provide very critical habitat for other species. As I mentioned, these burrows really create habitat, and particularly for secondary users. So the secondary users are species like swift fox and burrowing owl, both of which are federally listed as endangered. Now, neither of these species can create their own burrows, so they really rely upon burrowing animals such as badgers to dig up these burrows, and when they're not using them, these species can occupy them. So they're really important for these secondary users. As well, they've been found, the Species at Risk Act in Canada lists species that are supported by badgers and by this burrowing activity. There's 27 of them. So this ranges from birds of prey, owls, woodpeckers, hawks. You've got some vegetation that's on the list, everything down to amphibians and reptiles. You even have a western harvest mouse that really relies upon badgers. So you can see that they kind of play this critical role for a lot of species in the grassland system. Okay, so this is kind of my favorite, some of my favorite things that I've learned about badgers that I wanted to share. So I've got some fun facts for you. They're generally solitary. So this is very similar to a lot of carnivores for a long time, particularly those that we assume are those solitary carnivores, which do spend a lot of time alone. They also do display kind of more social behavior. So you'll see them playing with their siblings. They'll play with their mother. They have some other interactions with other members of their families that we don't really clearly fully understand, but we're starting to observe it a little bit more. And they have a very successful reproduction strategy. If anyone is aware, it's very similar to what bears and wolverines also undergo, and it's a term referred to as delayed implantation. So basically what this is a badger will mate in late summer, and then the egg won't be fertilized, and it's just stored in their body and kind of remains dormant in the uterus until the winter when they're kind of in this rested state. And if the female is healthy enough, then the egg will be fertilized, and then about 5 weeks later, the badger will be able to have her kits, her young, and kind of right in time for spring. So when the snow is melting and when the food's starting to become more readily available again. So they have surprisingly large home range sizes and densities, particularly the home range sizes, but for how small they are. So if you ever see one, they kind of have these really short, stocky little legs, and you just wouldn't think that those little legs would be able to go that far. They have home ranges that can range anywhere, and this largely depends on their food availability. So how much natural prey they have kind of close by, but they can have home ranges. For males, will go up from a couple kilometers to 300 kilometers squared, and females are quite a bit smaller. So you might have up to 19, I don't know why I had that 109 in that slide there, sorry, but they're quite a bit smaller. When I had the opportunity to work with them during the breeding season, they do definitely become more active. The males are overlapping other female ranges, and so they're really trying to find a mate at that time, so they'll go a little bit further. We had one male badger move about 25 kilometers in less than 12 hours, and like I said, for an animal with short little stubby legs, it was a good distance for one night's run to find a lady. Their dispersal distances can range from 52 kilometers for females up to about 110 kilometers for males. And then their population densities, again, this kind of depends on the food availability and the habitat. But in Idaho, where they've done some work on this, they've reported that they usually there will find 2 to 6 badgers per kilometer squared. So another one, as I mentioned, they do get up and they do hunt and predate on ground squirrels all year round, which is pretty cool because you don't usually see them in the summer, much less the winter. These are a couple images. The one was with a remote camera, and then the other one, of course, is just evidence on the top of the snow of an animal coming out midwinter to go get a snack. So they'll dig up hibernating ground squirrels in the middle of the winter if they're getting too hungry. But similar to bears, they're not true hibernators, and they go through these cycles of what's called torpor. And basically, this just really allows them to reduce their metabolic function, reduce their heart rate, reduce their temperature, and kind of go into these rested states. So they're not fully hibernating, they're not fully asleep, but they're resting. And this is also the time that they'll have their kits and their young. So this is my favorite one. This is my favorite fun fact, is that they have this really interesting relationship and they work kind of cooperatively with coyotes. It's this mutualistic, kind of friendly-ish relationship that can improve hunting success, at least for coyotes. They found by a coyote hunting with a badger, it increases their success by about 1/3. And basically what these animals are doing is using each other's strengths. You know, coyotes see really well compared to a badger, and badgers have this great sense of smell because they spend so much time underground, and they have kind of different hunting strategies. A badger will be in the ground digging around into ground squirrel burrows and trying to get them to run up onto the surface. And when they do that, when they shoot out of their small holes and their small burrows, a coyote will then take advantage of that flea response by the ground squirrel, and then vice versa. Having that coyote at the entrance of a ground squirrel will maybe make them less likely to jump out, and then the badger is more likely to get a meal. So they've evolved to have this really interesting relationship, which you don't often see, particularly between two carnivores. So I thought I'd just touch on the leading threats to badgers. Like I mentioned, they're sensitive in Alberta, and then they're federally listed as endangered for the other 2 species to the east and this closest BC to our west. A large part of this is because of the loss of intact grassland. I think in Alberta, it's estimated that we have less than about 30% of native prairie in its natural state. And I'm not sure what it is for BC, but I'm assuming it's probably less. There's not a lot of grassland in the province of BC, and a lot of it is taken up by development. Extirpation of ground squirrel populations. This is a big one too, because that's obviously, even though they can supplement their diet, that's a preferred prey for them. So they do really rely on those species as a primary prey. And then direct cause human caused mortality directly, which is trapped, poisoned. There's a history there. And then road mortality is another big one. They do tend to cross roads fairly regularly, especially if they're going in between grassland systems. And they will, like I mentioned, they will actually dig their burrows along the roadside. So they are subject to kind of being close to roads and getting struck. That project that I mentioned that I worked on in central BC, they did find that over subsequent years, there was 2 brothers that siblings that were hit within a kilometer of each other. So they're also kind of using the same areas to move across these roads. So there's kind of these hot spots of mortality. So there's some ways that we can learn more about badgers. As I mentioned, we don't know very much about them in Alberta, but some of the research and monitoring techniques I was lucky to be a part of back in BC. You can use traditional techniques. So this is kind of VHF telemetry. So this is radio telemetry. Observation. One thing that's kind of neat about badgers compared to trying to observe, say, a wolverine, which moves at incredible distances and in really tough terrain, is that you can, with patience, sit next to habitat that they occupy and kind of sit with binoculars, and they'll eventually come up and start moving around. So you can observe their behavior. And then there's some more that are kind of newer techniques, which some of you may be more familiar with and heard of, is remote camera monitoring is used for a lot of species, so you can use them for getting a better understanding of badgers as well. You can do hair sampling to get their genetics, and that basically gives you a unique identifier as for an individual. So the hair sampling and the genetic analysis can be used to count the number of individuals in a population. And then GPS telemetry, kind of the upgrade to radio telemetry. So then you can have that GPS transmitter to get a really good handle on where they're moving kind of in real time. So this is just a couple images that were taken in central BC. One was with a female and or actually I think this was 3 kits. They do typically have about 2 to 3 kits at that den site. And then this was another one to the right at a crossing structure. So this crossing structure wasn't actually designed for a badger, it's just a culvert. We put some cameras up to see if they were using them, and in fact they were. So that was neat to see. And then the genetic hair sampling, as I mentioned. So if some of you might be familiar with the DNA and hair collection for bears, and that usually entails, putting strands of barbed wire on a tree, and the bears will rub against that barbed wire and lift the hair. So it's the same, if you're familiar with that, this is the same idea. I'm always forgetting what these are called, but they're basically the bottom of kind of what you fix a carpet to the floor with. And you can put these on these little Velcro straps, and then you fix them to the top of a burrow. And when the badger comes out, you can collect their hair that way. And this is the GPS telemetry I was mentioning. So earlier I talked about how they're kind of built for digging. They're these stocky animals, and they also have really loose fur, particularly around the neck. Such loose fur that you can actually roll their skin a little bit over their eyes when you have them mobilized, and there's a lot of fur there. So you can't collar them like a typical neck collar that you would see on a lot of animals that are being monitored using collars. So this was again back in 2008. I was working for a biologist by the name of Richard Claffey, and he was, I believe, the first to be trialing these GPS backpacks on badgers, which ended up working really well. They're originally designed for migrating birds, and they were adapted for badgers. So this is another way that you can get a better understanding of where they're going, what they're doing, and how many there are. Okay, little break from me talking, I guess, rambling on. Just wanted to throw out a few true or false questions for you. So first one, it's a little bit difficult because we're not in person right now, so maybe you can just throw things in the chat and we can, or just think about them anyways. It could just be food for thought, either way. So true or false, badgers can be aggressive. You can chew on that for a second. And the answer is true. So they're not typically aggressive. They're not going to run across a meadow and attack you, but I wouldn't advise putting your hand in their burrow. True or false? Badgers are dangerous. Goes kind of similar to what I answered above. True and false. So they're dangerous when you corner them, but they're not going to actively pursue you to cause you harm. And true or false? Badger burrows pose a significant threat to livestock and their operations. And the answer, because I have it underlined, is significant. The answer is false. There's a lot of discussion around this, and I'll touch on this in a little bit, but the work that, and the little bit of research that's been done about this and just trying to figure this out is that it doesn't seem to be a significant threat. So what I mentioned was there was a survey, this was also done in BC, and 131 cattle ranchers were contacted to talk to them about their experience with badgers. And out of those surveyed, there was less than 1% of the respondents attributed livestock injury to a badger burrow directly. So that's the only study that's been done to try and kind of quantify that risk so far. So kind of on that note, living with badgers. So first I'll kind of talk about urban coexistence, or the idea of the more urban, I suppose. The Glenbow Provincial Park, Glenbow Ranch Provincial Park, which some of you are probably familiar, which is just outside of Calgary, had badgers return, and people weren't too familiar with having badgers around again. So we put out some messaging to try and encourage a few of these things. So keeping your dogs off leash. So again, like I said, the badgers aren't usually aggressive or dangerous unless you go sticking your nose into their hole, and so into their burrow entrance. So you don't really want your dog doing that. It's kind of avoiding these negative encounters by keeping your pets at your side and on leash. Enjoying them from far. There was a lot of excitement around having badgers back at a park close to Calgary, and so there was several photographers trying to get nice and close. And as I mentioned, they have fair amount of tolerance for people, but it only goes so far. So if you spend too much time near a badger burrow, they're going to take off. Another thing that they'll do, which is kind of a fun image, which I've seen them do, is if you're bothering them enough, they'll actually backfill their burrow. So you'll start seeing dirt kind of filling up that entrance, so they feel safer once they've done that. So the suggestion here is to kind of break out that zoom lens. Drive with caution. As I mentioned, road mortality is actually one of the leading causes for decline for the species, as well as habitat loss. So wherever you do see signage there, I don't believe we have any in Alberta, but there's definitely some in BC. So just, and maybe places that you think you've seen a badger before. So kind of on rural roads where you have a lot of grassland habitat around, just, you know, for badgers and other species, just keep your eyes open and try to adhere to the signage that's there. That goes a long way. And then living with badgers on the prairie. So when I first gave this presentation, I wasn't too sure what that looked like. I wasn't sure how you could kind of mitigate for living with badgers out on the prairie. The main concern is, of course, having your livestock or any of your operational equipment that on a working landscape out there that is impacted by badgers. And so this was kind of a question mark, and I was really, you know, interested if anybody had any suggestions or thoughts around this. But I also came across some recommendations that is put out by Multistar. And so some of these are kind of manage your vegetation. So in areas of concern, so maybe there's areas that you really don't mind having them around and some areas that you are more concerned for them. And in this case, you could allow your vegetation to grow taller, so kind of minimizing that really preferred habitat by their prey, by ground squirrels. Another one is to support other predators, so retaining some woody areas that are suitable for raptors. Raptors will predate on both ground squirrels and badgers, so that's kind of a natural way to limit their numbers a little bit. And then, of course, all of us just having a little bit more tolerance, kind of if and where that's possible. And another thing we can do is really maybe try and understand what cynos of badgers look like. So I wanted to share this. This was developed by the Badger Recovery Team in BC. And basically, as you see here, it's a badger burrow ID card. And because often it can be kind of confusing. You're not, you're looking at a hole in the ground and you're not sure if that's a coyote den, or if that's ground squirrel, or if that's badger. So this kind of can give you some ideas, some measurements, and you can figure out if it is badgers that you have around, or if it's coyote activity, vice versa. You can see there, they also do have a picture of that plug badger burrow that I was talking about. So when they kind of get annoyed with you, they'll plug it back up. So that's what they're showing there. And I think that's kind of what I have for you this evening. I may have run through that sort of quickly, but maybe that gives us more time for questions and for discussion. So I really thank everyone for being here tonight. It was a great turnout, and I hope you enjoyed what I had to share. If you have more information or questions, please contact Riley at Salts. And I think from there I can pass it back over to Riley and Sasha, if you've been monitoring for questions, or kind of open the floor up.
Wrong button. There I am. Thank you so much, Nikki. That was a fantastic presentation. And yes, there are questions in the question box that I will start posing to you. And then just encourage our audience, if you do have questions, please feel free to type them into the question box area, and we'll scroll through and get to them. I know that Nikki has said that she will answer the questions. Donna, I'm hoping that the screen thing ended up working out for you. I think it probably did, because we didn't get any more questions from you about that. And I am just trying to get this so I can, okay. So our first question is from Brittany. Why do they have an affinity to burrow near roadways? What benefits do they provide for them? Was a question.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so basically it's that friable soils I mentioned. So our cut banks have sort of already been flipped and cut into, and so it just really, it's kind of softens the soil. So if we have areas that have really like compact from whatever activities we're doing, our soils are really compact, that kind of excavation, it just opens the soil up to be a little bit better for digging. So that's essentially what it is. It's easy for them. Yep.
Perfect. The next question is from Claudia, and she asks, do badgers carry any diseases, for example, rabies?
Well, that's a really good question. I don't believe so. If they do, I have never heard of them passing it on. They may, but again, very few people have run-ins with badgers, like unless you're actively pursuing them. So I wouldn't think it's something for you to worry about. Yeah.
Okay, and then the next question is, what do you think are some of the most pressing research needs for badgers on the prairies?
I think one of the most pressing need is probably understanding how many we have and where they are. It's very basic for most species. We sort of have that information. That's really kind of baseline population estimate and distribution. I think that would be the best start at getting an understanding of where they still are and how they're doing. Yep.
Perfect. Okay. And then the next one is, she says, thank you, Nikki. Really interesting and attractive presentation. And is wondering if your presentation is recorded and will be shared later to attendants. And so that is something that it is recorded today, and we're hoping that to have or make this available to participants and participants that weren't able to join us today. So yes, that's something that's going to be done, and you will be able to find on the Prairie Conservation Forum website. And I'm sure that we could provide links to those that weren't able to make it as well. There's lots of questions rolling in, just to let you know.
Okay. No problem.
So the next question was very interesting. Thank you, Nikki. Do you know if wildlife fencing is an effective way to prevent highway mortality, and or are they more likely to cross roadways through fencing?
No, I think if you had some more like drift fencing, so a similar fencing to what you would probably have for if you're familiar with reptiles and amphibians, so that cloth fencing. So other animals like coyotes and etc. can get over that drift fencing, but for an animal like a badger, they don't jump very high. So and some of it is knowing where those pinch points are, and so you can funnel them and use that fencing to sort of direct them into a nearby culvert or crossing structure that goes underneath the highway. So that's one way you could do it.
Thanks, Nikki. Julia asks if you can identify individuals by their markings.
If you can, I haven't been able to do it. I haven't been around them, probably the individuals enough. It would be tricky. I know for a lot of animals, their markings change a little bit over time too. But we figured out how to do it with ventral patches for wolverines, that they have different unique patches on their chest. So, you know, if somebody wanted to give it a try, you never know, maybe someone will come up with a way that you could do it. Yeah.
And then just a comment from Claudia. She said, really neat presentation, especially the fun facts. Caitlin asks, is there access to the survey that was done with the ranchers regarding livestock injuries from badger holes?
Yeah, that's freely available. I think it's freely available online. We could potentially have the link sent out.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a publication. So we could maybe have that sent out.
Absolutely. If you share it with me, I can send it, or I could put it in the email that will follow up after.
Okay.
Claudia asks another question and offers thank you. Do they have single offspring or litters?
Small litters, so they usually have 2 to 3 kits. And those kits are with their mothers for about 6 months.
Okay. And Elizabeth, hi Elizabeth, asks, I've heard about biologists seeing badgers high up in the alpine along the continental divide in southern Alberta. Can you speak to whether these would be Jeffersoni or Texas subspecies?
Yeah, that's a really good question, especially the area that you're talking about, because I have heard that there's some indication that genetically speaking, that might actually be another subspecies in that sort of southeast portion of BC. So I guess it probably depends where they're showing up. And yeah, you'd have to look into that a little bit. In terms of being kind of high mountain, it is interesting. There's reports also, if you're familiar with where Lake Minnewanka is in Banff National Park, there's been old reports of them coming right through there. So I think maybe they'd make these larger movements and they end up going through the mountain passes. And yeah.
Perfect, thank you, Nikki. And then just, yeah, Caitlin says thank you and great presentation. And I don't see any further questions there. So yeah, I'm going to just share my screen once I have your once I have this up and ready, but just while I'm doing this, I'll continue to monitor. You're getting just oh, here's another question. There's like a lot of thank yous and great presentations and whatnot. So good job, Nikki. So from Anthony, hey Nikki, great presentation. Was curious if you're aware of the population of badgers in the Kootenays.
I don't know as much about them. No, I guess in terms of numbers, or is there, yeah. I don't know how they're doing down there, I guess, specifically to answer that question. I spent a little bit more time working with them in central BC, so I don't know as much. Yeah, but good question.
Yes, thank you. I'm struggling here. There it is. And so as I pull this up and switch your screens with some of these, I've got many boxes open. Sorry, everybody, as I struggle through this. I just want to offer my thank yous on behalf of the Prairie Conservation Forum, and offer my thank you to SALT for approaching us about sharing this webinar. And Nikki did present at our AGM, and or not our AGM, but our fall meeting. And so it's been fantastic to listen to this twice, and there's some new stuff been added. And so I don't see any more questions. And I'm not seeing you guys anymore with my screen. So this is not going to work, but that's okay. My slide was just a recognition of saying that we're going to adjourn for the evening. But again, thank you, Riley with Salts, for introducing Nikki. Thank you, Nikki, for your wonderful presentation. And just to let all the participants know that there will be a follow-up email with an opportunity to provide feedback to Nikki. There's a survey link, and we would really appreciate your time in filling that out. It's really quick, and I'll also try and get that linked to the report in that email that comes out. And if it doesn't come in that email, I'll send it in a subsequent one. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you, Nikki. And yeah, we hope to see you guys join us again soon. Cheers.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.